The first guy that I actually got into on my own was Elton John. And I saw him for the first time in July of 1976. So you got to imagine, bicentennial year, he's playing at the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, which is the closest big indoor arena to Washington, D.C. So he comes out, and only he can, in like an Elton John type Uncle Sam outfit. And I was literally 12 years old. I was a month away from being 13. And I'm there, and it's just like, you're walking around going, God, what does that smell? And then, of course, years later, you find out everybody's smoking pot.
Yeah.
And it's me and another guy, and we're literally 10 feet from the stage. It was, the floor was wide open. You could stand on the floor, and we were small enough and young enough, and we didn't care. So we're up close to the stage, and it was just wild.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and today we are getting off the Bruce train, and we're getting on a pirate ship, maybe? We are going to talk a little Bruce as well. Jack Hyland is joining me this morning. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you much for having me.
I am so thrilled. You reminded me that you had posted something on Twitter about Jimmy Buffett, and I reached out because I'm a big Buffett fan too. I don't think as big as you are, but I am certainly have gone through my phases of listening to Jimmy. And I said, hey, would you want to talk on the show? And you said, absolutely. So welcome. And I'm so glad that we're starting off the spring talking a little music.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So let's start out. Just tell us a little about yourself. Let my audience know a little about you.
Well, I'm 57 years old. I'm married with a child. Somehow he turns 25 years old this coming May.
Mine turned 31 in February, and I go, how the hell did my little boy become this grown up?
It is unbelievable how they get old and we stay the same. I've lived on the East Coast most of my life, with the exception of a very brief time in in 1999. My wife got into graduate school in Southern California, so we were out there then. But I've either lived in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where I am now, or Charleston, South Carolina, or White Plains, New York, and for a very brief time in Africa, which is a whole different story. And my wife is currently in Africa now for work. I used to own a bar, which kind of goes hand in hand with the whole Jimmy Buffett thing. But we sold it last year because we thought we'd be spending most of our time in Africa. And the whole COVID thing put an end to all of that. But my wife went back to Africa last month, and she is still there. And I'm waiting to renew my my passport. And then I'll be heading back there with her in Angola. And we'll be there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Did you sell the bar because COVID was happening, or this was just a happy accident? You ended up selling it because you thought you were going to be spending a lot of time overseas?
Well, it's a combination of a couple of things. One, we own the building that the bar was in with a couple of my siblings and a couple of other people. And the building had 9 apartments in it. So it was a pretty big building, and it was about 150 years old. And it took a lot of money to keep it in shape to rent. And some of the owners wanted to sell it. My wife and I did not, but we just couldn't work out a deal to keep it ourselves. And we thought, after so many years of owning the building and basically paying rent to ourselves with the bar, we didn't want to go to paying rent to somebody else. We didn't know what a new landlord would be like. So we just thought, you know what, if we're going to be in Africa, let's just get rid of everything. So we did. And that's kind of where we are now.
So what is in Africa? You mentioned your job. And
Actually, my
yeah.
wife's job, she works for an energy company, and they've sent her to Angola about 3 years ago, and she's been there off and on since. And Angola is on
Yeah.
the west coast of Africa, kind of lower west coast, and it's eye-opening. There is poverty like you cannot imagine. It's just really, really eye-opening.
I can only imagine, and it is. We'll have to spend a few minutes talking about that because I can only imagine. Um, I I was in like the sixth or seventh grade when my dad was stationed in Germany with the
Mhm.
military,
Yeah.
and I've spent a total of like 5 weeks in Manila working for a job, but I've
Okay.
never been, like full time for that. So I guess there's a lot of things that are beautiful about it, and then a lot of things that must be frustrating.
It's really strange because my wife calls it a golden jail cell because they pay good money to be there, but there's nothing you can really do. Um, you can't walk down the streets because the minute they see you, they see a white person, they're just like, oh, you must be a rich oil person. And you're just always a target. And as a friend of mine pointed out, welcome to being black in America. And I thought, wow, never really thought about it like that until I was there. And, we do have a bunch of friends that we met, and most of them are from Britain. There's a handful of Americans, handful of people from India. So we've got, they call them these expats. They're a different breed. They know they're not afraid of a little adventure, obviously, or they wouldn't be there. You have a handful of people to pick and choose from to hang out with. Unfortunately, the crew that we were with were a lot of fun to hang out with, but boy, those Brits can drink. And I left Angola last March 11th. And I made a joke to these people. I was like, I got to go back to the States just to sober up. And with the exception of June 13th, which is my wedding anniversary, I had 3 beers that night. I haven't had a drink since then. And my wife texted me last week. She went out with a couple of the Brits last weekend, and she said, "Oh my God, they were drinking for like 10 hours." And I'm like, "Yeah, I wasn't kidding when I said I have to go home and sober up." So it's a good crowd. I mean, there's worse places to be, and it's fun, but it's you got to keep your eyes open all the time.
Is there, yeah, luckily, when I was at Manila, I was working nights because it's day over here.
Right.
And I did not go anywhere that wasn't with someone I had the company had a car service that picked us
Correct.
up and took us there, and it was
Yes.
so. And then I would go with lunch to someone, which is like weird at 2-3 in the morning. We're going to lunch,
Yeah.
and they would take me to different restaurants, and I enjoyed the experience. But I can imagine I've had a couple of friends that have lived in the Middle East. One of my best friends is an SAP consultant, and so he's traveled the world helping people you know implement SAP, and it just depends on how much you can embrace the culture and do. I think her description is actually sounds pretty apt, right?
Yeah.
While it there is good money, and I assume you guys are staying in some place fairly nice, but it is just a weird world, isn't it?
It really is. And nobody speaks English. But you're right about the car service. I mean, you don't go anywhere without a car service, and they're kind of a car service slash security. I mean, they don't carry weapons as far as I know, but they are really wise about just keeping people out of situations they shouldn't be in. But one of the things we have used it for is kind of a springboard to go other places. While we were there, we flew one weekend to Namibia, which is one country over, but Angola, which is a country we're in, and again, we're on the very west coast, is twice the size of the state of Texas. So it's a really big country. So it takes a lot to get out of the country.
Sure.
And we flew to Namibia one weekend, and and that was kind of fun. And then one weekend we flew to Cape Town, South Africa, which was spectacular. And one of the upsides is they actually spoke English there. So you could kind of let your brain relax for a couple of days and just go, okay, I don't have to worry about trying to figure out what people are saying or how to get around. And so, yeah, that's kind of the one thing we want to do while we're there, is use it as an opportunity to jump to some other place, some other country to, I've always said when people like say to me, gee whiz, Africa. And I'm kind of like, well, it was never kind of on the radar, but how many chances in your life do you get to go to Africa? So that's kind of the way we look at it.
Where you mentioned living on the East Coast most of your time. So I always like to start at the beginning. So where did you talk about growing up? Was there a lot of music in your household as you grew up?
So, I got a kind of a backstory.
Please.
I was born in White Plains, New York, which is right outside of New York City. And my folks were born and raised there as well. My grandmother, my father's mother, was born and raised in Burlington, New Jersey, which is exit 5 off the Jersey Turnpike. So we would go visit her, once or twice a year up in White Plains with my grandfather and my father's siblings. But my father had an aunt who lived in Burlington her entire life. She never married. She worked for City Hall in Burlington her whole life. And occasionally we would stop at her house on the way to White Plains. And this was mostly in the mid 70s and the early 80s. And I just remember even then, Burlington is about, God, if I remember correctly, 17 or 18 miles outside of Philadelphia. But it was the most depressing, rundown city that I'd ever spent any time in. And I was just like, good Lord. And so, a couple years later, when I discovered Springsteen, I felt like I had my own Jersey connection in a small way.
Sure.
So when he was talking about, the lower class and, the hopelessness, and I knew exactly what he was talking about. But in my house, my parents actually saw Buddy Holly live. My father was a big Buddy Holly guy.
Wow.
I know it's odd. And, that's one of the benefits of growing up outside of New York City in the, the late 50s, early 60s. Mm-hmm. But after Buddy Holly died, my father just he didn't really progress with the times. I mean, my father was as conservative as you could ever imagine. I can't imagine any of the music from the 60s did anything for him. In fact, he just revolted against the long hair people. Yeah. But my upbringing was not great. My father was a abusive alcoholic. So it was easier for me to just hide out in my room and read and listen to music. So I had an older brother who, he had music before I did, but he was into kind of like Motown and R&B, stuff like that, which I wasn't really into. The first guy that I actually got into on my own was Elton John. And I saw him for the first time in July of 1976. So you got to imagine, bicentennial year. He's playing at the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, which is the closest big indoor arena to Washington, D.C. So he comes out, and only he can, in like an Elton John type Uncle Sam outfit. And I was literally 12 years old. I was a month away from being 13. And I'm there, and it's just like, you're walking around going, God, what is that smell? And then, of course, years later, you find out everybody's smoking pot. Yeah. And it's me and another guy, and we're literally 10 feet from the stage. It was, the floor was wide open. You could stand on the floor, and we were small enough and young enough, and we didn't care. So we're up close to the stage, and it was just wild. And so I was into Elton John a lot, and then it kind of shifted to Billy Joel. But I specifically remember sitting at home one day, and I was listening to a radio station out of Washington, D.C., and I don't remember what radio station it was. And I was by myself, and I just heard a song come on, and it was Promised Land.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember listening to it going, oh my God, I am not alone. Somebody else knows what I'm going through. And, of course, back then you're kind of like, who was that? Who is this guy? What,
Right.
and, you find out it's Bruce Springsteen, and this was right after Darkness came out. And at the time, my uncle, this is a whole nother story as well. He played in the NFL for 10 years. So he owned a bar outside of New York City in White Plains.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a jukebox. And somehow we used to end up getting a bunch of the singles off the jukebox. And somehow I grabbed Born to Run, the single. And the flip side of it was Meeting Across the River. And I'll never forget, like Columbia Records, for some reason their LPs had the red record label, but the 45s were orange, the label. And I just remember wearing Born to Run out on the single, well before I had money to buy the album.
Yeah.
And then whenever I had a chance, I bought Born to Run, which to me is pretty close to the perfect album, from the packaging. I mean, the album cover is as beautiful as anything you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah.
The words inside it, the music, it's just close to the perfect album. And
I'm sure that many of my audience are nodding their head yes.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything lacking, and this is kind of a quibble to me, it's just that it's kind of one song short of being perfect. But other than that, it's just flawless.
Yeah.
And, then I got to that. And then I got into Darkness, of course, when that came out. And then, it was a couple years before The River came out. But when I was in high school, the big stuff was, the stuff from like Saturday Night Fever and Grease.
Yeah.
And it was never cool to like that stuff, but I always loved it. I was just always been a big fan of good pop music.
Yeah. So you're a few years younger than I am. I'm 62.
Okay.
I graduated high school in 77. So you would have graduated like in 81, 82.
I graduated in 81. I had a brother who graduated in 79 and another brother who graduated in 80.
Right. So, and I think when you and I had talked on via Twitter, I had sent you, I sent you the link to this episode where I talked to David Fetter, who's a huge Bee Gee fan.
Right.
And we shared. So, yeah, our era, AM radio was everything. And you just listened and, I'm laughing because my first 8-track I bought with my own money was Elton John's Greatest Hits.
Well, there you go.
When I remember seeing Billy Joel on Saturday Night Live and not knowing, the hit was You're Always a Woman to Me, right?
Yep.
That was what was on the radio, but he had played Only the Good Die Young, I believe, and I was like, what is this great song? So buying every Billy Joel album I could find as they come.
Sure.
I have that, you and I have a very similar taste, except I never discovered Bruce that early. It wasn't till The River and I started dating Linda, who I'm been married to for 35 years. And she had a good friend named Lisa who came back from the East Coast and was talking about this guy named Bruce Springsteen. And so I remember, buying The River and liking it. And then when Born in the USA went out, everyone knew Bruce Springsteen then.
Right.
Yeah. So you were a little bit ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I was fortunate, and it might have been just because, I'm basically a state and a half away from New Jersey.
Yes.
And also just the way I grew up. I mean, although my father had a great job, he was middle class.
Yeah.
I never wanted for anything, but my home life was not pleasant. So
Yeah.
I knew what he was singing about. And then along with Bruce, but after Bruce, I discovered Bob Dylan, who for 40 years has been my favorite musician. And he pretty much changed everything for me. So I've always kind of gravitated toward the singer-songwriters, the Randy Newmans, the Billy Joels, the guys who write about, and you can throw Buffett in there as well. They
Yeah.
write about what they know. And I just had a lot more in common with Bruce. But it's funny, I got older and I thought, I kind of dropped out of the pop music scene after 1992. Like the last album I really loved was REM's Automatic for the People. And then kind of Kurt Cobain took over the world. And I just thought, God, what a dreary son of a gun. And I never liked him. I still don't like him. It's like he invented, I'm the first teenager whose life sucks. I'm like, well, no, you're not the first guy to sing about that. I said, Bruce was singing about that years ago. But to me, the difference is with Bruce, there's always a little bit of hope that you might just make it out. And that's probably why I liked him so much.
Yeah. So I want to get to, because one of the things you had shared about is you're also a huge Buffett fan.
Yep.
But when I always preface this question, Jack, with the premise, I do not believe the amount of times you've seen any artist, but specifically Bruce, is a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are, because that all depends on your age and what, where you're located, your economic situation. But have you seen Bruce perform live, and do you keep count of how many times?
I have seen him. I was actually trying to count it up last night.
Yes.
And I can't remember if it's 8 times or 9. There's one I just can't remember, but I'm pretty sure it's 9.
Okay.
The first time I saw him was in 1984. I wanted to see him for the River Tour, but I just couldn't get tickets. So in 1984, he was playing the Capitol Center. My older brother and I and another guy, a friend of ours, it was a Sunday afternoon, and we're at another friend's house, and we're sitting around drinking and carrying on as you do when you're barely 21 years old. And I just said, look, Springsteen's playing up at the Capitol Center tonight. Let's go. So we drive up there. We don't have any tickets. And somehow in the parking lot, we find 3 tickets together, $35 a piece. But okay, pretty much a bargain. Bargain then, bargain today.
Yeah.
And Bruce in 1984, I don't think people understand how big he was. In 1984, like the 4 biggest pop stars in the world were Springsteen, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Madonna.
Yes.
It was the whole MTV thing. There was this explosion of pop culture. And of those 4, Bruce was the only one who didn't have to go, or just chose not to go anywhere with a 50-person strong entourage of security, which is kind of like, look at me, I have bodyguards, but don't come near me. I mean, that's just not Bruce. And of those 4, Bruce is the only one who you could literally think you could walk into a bar and see him at the end of the bar and pull up a bar stool next to him and just have a normal conversation with him. And then I think about all these years later, where they are. Obviously Michael Jackson's dead. Prince is dead. Madonna's, who knows what the hell Madonna's doing.
Yeah.
And Bruce is still just the guy you could pull up next to in a bar stool. And it's always been, to me, he's one of those rare pop stars who has achieved the level of fame he has, but he's just a normal guy. As we noticed, learned a couple of weeks ago when he had that ridiculous DUI charge, he pulled over to the side of the road to have a shot of tequila with fans of his. And that's just, who does that?
Yeah.
And that's part of his appeal as well. So anyway, to get back to your story, I happened to see him at the Capitol Center in '84. And at the time, the worst albums he had to pick from were Greetings and The Wildly Innocent, which are great albums. So there was just, the proverbial never a dull moment in that concert. I mean, he did a couple of things from Nebraska, but he just kept, you're just coming out with song after song. And then you're like, oh my God, he's run out of songs. Then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, he does Rosalita. And you're like, oh my God, how did I forget about this one? And it's just incredible. And, one of the most memorable nights of my life.
What I find you're saying this really well. The idea that, and I'm going to ask you in a little bit, about songs you may be chasing both for Jimmy and Bruce, but the idea that he does a 3-hour show and that you could walk away going, well, I didn't get to hear blank, 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 or blank. Right. Like, right. I've told this story so many times. So regular listeners, I apologize, but I was at the Houston show during the High Hopes tour. And at the very end of the show, it was a great show, a lot of little gems. And this lady was very drunk going, is it over? I'm like, yeah, it's over. But he didn't play Born in the USA. I'm like, well, he doesn't always play Born in the USA.
Right.
But it's his biggest hit.
Oh my God.
So then the joke I make every time in the future when he played Born in the USA, I would tweet, and somewhere there's a drunk lady in Houston very happy.
My wife gets really mad whenever he does the Detroit medley. She's like, I didn't come here to hear him sing this. I came here to hear him sing his own stuff. And I kind of agree with her. It's like, wow, that's 12 minutes that's 4 songs of his own he could be doing. So, but you take what you get.
Yeah. And that's, my son always is, when he went to his first show, when Bruce was playing in Oklahoma City, we had drove up there and he said, shout? Is this an 8th grade dance?
Right.
Don't get me wrong. It was an amazing song. And he says, whatever they do is cool, but shout, what, and I do think that, and of course, Bruce, I'm sure he needs my advice, right?
Right.
You wonder if sometimes you wouldn't do, if you want to close with an oldies, do the rotate of the Detroit Multi, shout, some of the other things that he's done with this, to kind of change it up. But, as I've said many times and a guest says, they're the best bar band in the world. And in a lot of ways, that's what they still think they are.
Sure.
Sure.
And they got to do what they're interested in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one of my best friends is always like, does he have to do Born in the Run every show? Like, couldn't we, that's it. We could get a different song. And I'm like, well, but every show is someone's first show.
Correct.
And if you go to see Bruce and you don't get to hear Born to Run, aren't you a little bit unhappy?
Right.
Right. So, yeah. So what originally led to this is you mentioned about seeing Buffett a multitude of times.
Yep.
So talk to me a little bit. Like, I certainly remember when I found out that the Margarita guy was the Come Monday guy.
Right.
I was a lot more impressed. I mean,
Right.
I liked Margaritaville,
right.
but I loved Come Monday. Just
right.
It was a song that I just adore.
Right.
And Coconut Telegraph was the first 8-track of his that I bought and I adored. I adored every song on Coconut Telegraph.
Yep.
The Weather Is Here, I Wish You Were Beautiful is one of my favorite songs that, and I've never seen Jimmy live. It just never worked out.
Wow.
He's here every summer in Dallas.
Sure.
And we just never make time to go see him. But talk to me about, how did you discover Jimmy, and why seeing him live became a passion of yours.
So in 1979, my older brother went off to college, and he went to a small college in Maryland called Mount St. Mary's. And one weekend that fall, me and a couple of my high school buddies drove up there to spend a weekend with him, which meant basically just drinking and carrying on. And so we get there on a Friday night, and the next morning we're in his dorm, and there's a bunch of guys in the hallway there, and they're all painting the hallway. They're painting the walls and painting the ceilings and, just spiffing up the place. And we're thinking, okay, what's going on here? And they're all wearing t-shirts and long ties. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, so this is what college is like. I mean, at the time, I'm a sophomore in high school. But they're all listening to Jimmy Buffett. And I didn't know anything about Buffett. I mean, I'm sure I'd heard of Margaritaville.
Mm-hmm.
But, I just got home, and I probably bought Changes in Latitude.
Sure.
And then the following summer, Buffett was playing Meriwether Post Pavilion, which is an indoor kind of, the name says, a pavilion. So it's got an indoor amphitheater kind of thing. And then there's got a big lawn that probably holds 10,000 people.
Absolutely.
So that's about an hour and a half north of here. So me and my older brother and one of his college roommates, whose name was John, but for whatever reason, he's always been Juan.
Okay.
So, and to this day, he's Juan, and I keep in touch with him still. We go to the show, and we're in, I want to say, like the 12th row, which the only reason I'm saying this is because back then, that's how easy it was to get tickets to see Buffett.
Yeah, exactly. I understand.
And Margaritaville was like the fourth song in the set list. It wasn't the big deal that it became. And it was almost more of a, Buffett was still kind of more of a country musician than the Caribbean pop star that he became.
Right.
But you're right. It was, Come Monday, A Pirate Looks at 40, Tin Cup Chalice, all that great stuff that you never were going to hear on the radio. And as you said about Coconut Telegraph, that was the first album that came out after I became a fan. In fact, I remember listening to, before I bought it, one of the local DC radio stations used to play albums at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And I remember recording it, but not listening to it that night. And then at some point later on, I was listening to it, and I'm like, oh man, Buffett's getting old. There's like no party songs on there. And then you get older and you're like, wait, what is Coconut Telegraph? What is The Weather Is Here? And like you, I just think it was just such a great record. And then I remember, so anyway, we used to go to Meriwether Post every year, and sometimes Buffett would play there 2 nights in a row, and some nights he would play there 3 nights in a row. So we would just go up there, and right outside the amphitheater was a place called the Columbia Inn. We would stay at the Columbia Inn, and then there was kind of a little strip shopping center where they had a couple of bars. And after the show, a lot of the guys in the bar would go to these bars. And in fact, one night we spent a lot of time with some of the band members in the bar, and I was in an elevator in the hotel, and Buffett actually walked into the elevator. So for about 6 floors, me and a buddy of mine had Jimmy Buffett all to ourselves. But so I remember thinking, God, I hope Buffett just stays on the road, so I can see him year after year after year. And looking back on it, it's funny that he was one of the few guys who stayed on the road year after year after year.
Yeah.
So I saw him every year from 1980 to 1993. I didn't see him in 93 because I was living in New York at the time, and I moved back to Virginia, and it just didn't work out. And then I didn't see him in 96. My wife and I actually moved to Key West. She was 6 months pregnant. Not our best move, by the way. So we moved to Key West, and we're there for a little while. Our son is born in Key West, and my wife just was like, no, I got to get out of here. Although she loves Key West, she's not the kind of person to kick her feet up and watch the world go by.
Right.
So we left Key West and moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where she had gone to college, and we stayed there for 3 years. And it just so happened at that time, Buffett actually referred to Charleston as kind of like his minor league area. So he would go there with his band, and they would, do tour rehearsals and that kind of thing. My wife was working for a local television news station there. And in downtown Charleston, a Margaritaville store opened up. There wasn't a bar. It was just a store that sold like merchandise and that kind of thing. And Buffett was going to be there for the grand opening. And the people who worked with her at the news station brought her down there, and on the way down there said, by the way, you're going to interview Jimmy Buffett. Now, my wife, yeah, she just worked behind the scenes, but they knew she was such a big Buffett fan that they let her interview him. Mm-hmm. And we had that somewhere on tape somewhere. I have no idea where it is. But so we saw him a bunch in Charleston. One of the places when I was living in New York, he used to play Jones Beach, which is on Long Island, and the stage is literally in the water. So it was just a perfect place to see Buffett. And one of the upsides of it was you could guarantee that he would always play The Weather's Here because the stage is right in Long Island Sound.
Yeah.
So it worked out well. But going back, just listening to Buffett, there was a couple of things about him that struck me when he would talk about literature. He would just mention a book or an author, and I would go, I'm going to go get that book. And of course, this is 1980s, pre-internet. You're not looking up anybody online. You're going to a bookstore and you're seeing one in particular was in the song Incommunicado off of Coconut Telegraph. He talks about Travis McGee. I'm in a bookstore and I see a book that just says a Travis McGee novel. And I'm like, I don't know who Travis McGee is or what he is. But I get the book and I read it and I'm like, oh my God. And within, I don't know, 6 months, I had read all 22 Travis McGee novels.
Yeah.
Or Buffett would talk about Pat Conroy or obviously Key West. And that was always really attractive to me. And one of the things I liked about him was he paid attention to old people. He learned a lot from old people. When you're 22 years old, like me anyway, you just see an old person, you're like, what do they know? They're old and blah, blah, blah. But he learned a lot, and that kind of got me to open up my eyes and ears to old people. I mean, obviously they have a lot of experience. They have a lot of knowledge. And I always appreciated the fact that even at a young age, Buffett was aware enough of that he learned. And, I've given up trying to convince people that Buffett is more than Margaritaville. I don't care anymore if they like him or don't, but obviously he's much more than Margaritaville.
Yeah. I couple of stories. I will go back and forth on E Street Radio, and I mostly have it on the Springsteen East Street channel, but I also will turn it over to the Buffett channel sometimes.
Yeah.
And they have their version of Be the Boss, where you pick 5 songs, and my buddy Sam and I have often talked, and I'm not judging anyone who does this, but we go, okay, they go, all right, Jack, you can pick 5 songs of Bruce Springsteen's that you're going to, this is for an E Street channel audience. They're huge Bruce Springsteen fans. I'm not taking a slot and putting in Thunder Road.
Right. Because
we all adore Thunder Road.
Right.
Unless there's a specific reason, like I was lucky enough to do this several years ago. If I was going to do it again, I would probably do No Surrender, because when I had colon cancer, that was one of the songs I listened to.
Sure.
So there's a personal reason. So I'm not judging,
Right.
but that's the thought. And so we're listening to this, and I'm like, um, you got to imagine no one would pick Margaritaville if they're doing their 5-song set that you would want Jimmy to
Right.
do. And the person picked Margaritaville.
Oof.
And I was like, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just that whole reason, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you do? So, have you counted up how many times you've seen him? Because it was every year.
I've tried to count, and I got well into over 100, but then I'd go back and go, wait, that can't be possible. But then I just kept counting and going, yeah, I think it actually is. And, I've seen him everywhere. I've seen him in Florida. I've seen him in South Carolina. I've seen him in Maryland. I've seen him in Virginia. I've seen him in New York. I've seen him in Paris.
Oh, that must have been interesting.
Well, it just sounds like my wife and I, she was in London for work, and I was with her in London, and a friend of mine had 4 tickets to see Buffett in Paris. And he was going to go with his wife and another couple. And at some point, the other couple backed out. They couldn't make it. And he asked us if we wanted to go. And so we were like, well, we're already going to be in London. Why don't we just take the channel over and we'll go? So that's what we did. And we spent my wife and I spent about 48 hours in Paris, and we were drunk for about 46 of them.
Yes.
And so I remember the night of the show, we were going to go have a couple beers or drinks before the show. And we were walking into this bar, and walking out was a couple who you could tell was American. You could tell they were Parrot Heads. I'm not a big fan of Parrot Heads, by the way, but that's a whole different story. And you could tell they were there for the Buffett concert. And as they were walking out, there was a girl who probably thought the same of us. She just looked and she said, "We're leaving. This bar is charging $6 a beer." And my friend, whose name was Pete Rose, but not that Pete Rose,
yes,
that had been breaking stride. He just said, "You just paid $2,000 to get here, and you're worried about a $6 beer." So we walked in, and, yeah. So we had a bunch of beers, and the show was in a small theater, and I'll never forget my friend Pete, who got the 4 tickets. The whole show, he was so angry because he thought we had front row seats. We actually had like back row, the very last row seats. So he's just barking up a storm the whole time. And my wife and Pete's wife are like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" And I'm like, "I got this." I was like, "Pete, we're in Paris. We're at a Buffett concert. We couldn't be any more drunk. What is the problem?" And he just said, "All right, just let me be angry for 10 more minutes." And I'm just like, oh my God. So I was just happy that I could go out in the lobby and order 2 shots of Jameson's in a different language. So,
yeah.
I mean, and I look back and I think about that show, and it's actually the last time my wife and I have seen Buffett. After a while, she was kind of like, it's the same show every time.
I was going to ask that question. Does he, because one of the beautiful things about Bruce, and with the exception of the beginning of the River Tour in 2016, right, where he was doing the
Yes.
River in its entirety,
right?
It's very seldom that I always say about 60% of the show is the same.
Right.
The other 40% he splits up, and the 60% you see is in a different order, right?
Right.
So I was going to ask you, does Jimmy change it up a lot, or?
No, he doesn't. In fact, for many, many years, it was the same thing. And I'm like, how many times do you have to hear a Brown Eyed Girl live?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, apparently recently Buffett's come out with an album that it's called, like, it's his deep cuts. And I'm like, if you're a Jimmy Buffett song, there is no such thing as a deep cut. You know everything. So I would go and it would be like Brown Eyed Girl and Fins. And again, like you said earlier about Bruce, somebody's going to the Buffett show for the first time.
Absolutely.
he's not playing for me, the guy who's been there 100 times. And lately, though, he seemed to have, he kind of dropped the horn section that he carried with him. And he got kind of back to not necessarily his roots, because he doesn't have Fingers Taylor with him anymore and hasn't for many years. But I do want to see him one more time. I don't know where or when, but I do want to see him one more time.
So Jack, your experience with Jimmy Buffett is similar to my experience with the Beach Boys.
Okay.
And by the way, I just looked at that. It's songs you don't know by heart.
Right.
Jimmy Buffett.
Right.
And so anyway, I discovered the Beach Boys back in the summer of '77. I bought the CD, Endless Summer, had never heard them, was amazed by the harmony, and didn't get to hear them till like 1979, 1980. They came to Lafayette, Louisiana, which was about an hour and a half drive from where I lived, Lake Charles.
I've been to Lafayette.
Yes. And was amazed I got to hear them.
Yeah.
And then a couple years later, they were playing in Beaumont, Texas, which is 60 miles west of Lake Charles. And I saw them. Joan Jett opened.
Oh, boy.
And then when I moved to Dallas, they were here every summer.
Okay.
And every summer I went, and I had a blast.
Yeah.
And the thing that first started making me a little unhappy is Brian was no longer touring with them, and I was a huge Brian Wilson fan.
Oh yeah.
And then I saw them early in the summer of the same year that Cocktail came out.
Oh boy.
And they did not do Kokomo.
Okay.
And I went, but wait a minute, this song, you knew it was going to be in the soundtrack. You knew why wouldn't you be playing it? And then I heard later that they called it the beer song because when they played it, that's when people went out for beers, because no one wanted to hear anything new.
Right. Okay.
And so I'd gone and I'm like, okay, how many more times do I need to hear Mike live say, you don't want to hear any of those Car songs, do you? Oh, before he does the Car medley,
Sure.
And absolutely everyone's there in their beach, their Hawaiian print shirts, and there's beach balls flowing around, and we're in the lawn, the same thing as you were talking about, right? Where you had the seats that are under the pavilion, then the lawn. We're bringing friends. 1 year they toured with Chicago, which was amazing because you got to hear Carl's voice doing harmony on Chicago songs, and you got to hear, Chicago playing horns on some of the Beach Boy songs. But I went, I don't know. I don't need to go again because I know the song. I know it's an hour and a half set. It's all hits. There's nothing unusual.
Right.
So the same thing, right? That going, I'm not disparaging the people that go and have a good time. It's just, I don't need to see Mike Love and Bruce Johnston, ripping through the greatest hits.
Right. And that's kind of how it was for me in Buffett. I remember being at a Buffett concert and walking around going, man, nobody's partying. Nobody's, this is kind of boring. And then I thought, wait, I'm not drinking either. And, you go sit through the show and you can almost predict what's happening. And another thing I've always loved about Buffett is he is nothing but the consummate entertainer. He is not going to go on stage and talk politics. He's not going to do anything to offend his audience. He's going to play what he thinks his audience wants to hear. And for the most part, he does. I mean, name another guy who's toured and sold out everywhere he's played literally for almost 40 years. He knows what he's doing. But I guess there just came a point where I was like, okay, this isn't for me anymore. I did happen to see him in Manhattan in 1989. It was just him and Mac McAnally, who's his, kind of sidekick guitar player. And that was it, just the two of them. And that was great. If he could do more of that, then I'd be all in. But I don't see that selling out large arenas, so that's probably not going to happen. So, I'll just listen to the music, and I'm near 60 years old. I'm not sure I need to be going to all these concerts anymore anyway, but I think I still have one more Buffett concert in me. We just got to figure out where it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I told Linda, I said, well, and I think this COVID has made all of us feel like, okay, maybe I would want to go see Mike Love and them, go through that. I did go to the 50th anniversaries where Brian and Mike, I mean, they were Dave Marks, I mean, all the Beach Boys were there.
Yeah.
And I had a good time. It was funny though, because it worked out within a 2-week span. We had seen Bruce play in Louisville, Kentucky, and then we saw the Beach Boys here in Dallas.
Okay.
And it's like, what a difference. They're 10 years older than him, yet, they were, it was such a structured show. You knew
Right.
this was the song and this was
Sure.
the thing. And just imagine, once again, Bruce just does, you never know what you're going to get. You know you're going to give him 100%. He's going to give 100%. And I also can't fault, Jimmy has become a brand.
Oh, sure.
And and there's nothing wrong with that. And like I said, the CDs are there to hear and to bring that joy. I also know he was on 60 Minutes once, I believe, and in an interview, and I'm having to rely on memory, but he talked about that him and Bruce Springsteen talked about raising kids.
Right.
And he said, to the kids, you're just the guy that makes pancakes.
Sure.
They're, and I just always loved that story. The idea that, him and Bruce talking about, I make pancakes for the kids. I make pancakes for the kids. And and then when you later hear Bruce tell the story that as a rock star, right, you stay up late at night and you get up, late in the day.
Yeah.
And Patty telling him, you're missing it. The
Right.
morning is when it happens.
Yeah.
And so he said, he learned to make pancakes, and he learned to get up early to be there when the kids were little, because that's when they are talking, when they're excited and everything. So I think that's pretty awesome. With as many times as you've seen Jimmy, I'm sure there's deep cuts though you still wish you'd heard them live. So either him or Bruce, are there songs you wish the next time you hear them live you'd love to hear?
Buffett does a song that I'm not sure, I don't think I've heard it live. And the first time I heard it, I thought he wrote that song for me. And it's called Here We Are.
Okay.
And it probably came out, God, I don't even have a reference for it now. Certainly within the last 15 years. I don't even know what album it's on. And it's just kind of like his fans, and I just thought, God, he wrote that song for me. And I've never heard that one live, but I would like to. One of the songs from Bruce that I've never heard live, but the very first time I heard it, I remember there was a really quirky radio station. I think it was out of Washington, D.C., but it might have been out of Maryland, called WHFS.
Okay.
And they just played, 1 minute they'd be playing just off the wall, weird stuff. But it was the very first time I heard the song Jersey Girl.
Okay.
And if you listen to that song, you can tell that most of the audience had never heard that song before
Right.
before the night he did it live. And maybe because I had my own little Jersey connection, when he sings Cross the River to the Jersey Side and the audience just erupts, it to this day, no matter how many times I've heard that song, it just gives me chills. And then later on in the song, when he says down the shore, which is, if you're from that area, you know that's the proper way to say, you don't say I'm going to the shore, you say I'm going down the shore. And then the audience erupts again. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is just such a fantastic song. And I think it was on the flip side of the single, I want to say Cover Me, although it could have been I'm on Fire. It was something off of Born in the USA. And so I went out and bought that single, and I still have it somewhere. And of course, you know, we're talking 40 years ago. So
Yeah.
you didn't think you were going to be able to listen to it every time you want to get fired up on YouTube or Spotify or whatever. I would have liked to have heard that one live.
Okay.
But, you know, pretty much I've checked every other box with Bruce.
All right. So I'm sure you know this, but just in case the audience is screaming at me, you know, Tom Waits wrote Jersey Girl.
Correct.
But it is as a Bruce song as there can be.
Yes.
You know, similar to Bruce Johnston wrote I Write the Songs,
right,
which is such a Barry Manilow song, right?
Sure.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
But he wrote it for Brian Wilson.
Yes, exactly.
Or about Brian Wilson anyway.
Yes.
And by the way, as an aside, I have never seen the Beach Boys, but I saw Brian Wilson do the Lucky Old Son tour.
Yes.
Which might have been 2010, 8, I don't remember. Yeah. And I saw him in this tiny little arena, or a theater rather, in Washington, D.C. And I thought the Lucky Old Son album was fantastic.
I did too.
Yeah. And, you know, it was great, but it was sad because Brian Wilson would be talking between songs and you'd be like, oh my God, it's like listening to an 8-year-old.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how much Brian was actually doing or playing, and it didn't matter.
Yeah.
The band was so fabulous. And sitting there watching, you know, arguably Brian Wilson's the top 3 musicians of my lifetime as far as talent and reverence. So, yeah, that's my Brian Wilson experience. Brian Wilson is, he's just as good as, he's better than almost anybody. And, you know, you got to take the good with the bad with Brian Wilson.
Yeah. I went, he was touring, right after he had kind of fired Eugene Landy and kind of had done his own thing.
Yep.
He toured Pet Sounds live.
Okay.
Which
I didn't see that one.
Yeah. A lot of people say that that's one of the first, you know, doing your classic albums live in a row. And I was able to get, one of my best friends. I said, hey, Rick, I said, I really want to go see, you know, Brian Wilson live, but, you know, we don't really have the money and Linda isn't sure she wants to go. So will you go with me? And he goes, oh, I'll just get you free tickets, because at the time he was working for a company. He's an attorney, and he had to do all kinds of printing at this printing company, and the guy just had connections, and he said no one will want this, so he got us, like, you know, first row ticket, you know, front row tickets to see Brian. And so that was amazing to see, because it seemed like Brian was really engaged and want to go. I saw I saw him when he did the I'm drawing a blank on the album, where he did a lot of duets. I know. Anyway, it's a pun album. The title is an album, and so I'm looking, no peer pressure. Yeah.
Yep, I knew that. I
Yeah.
knew Peel was in there somewhere.
Yeah. So, and I watched that and it was really good. But you do see that his voice is getting tougher.
Yeah.
And so I was really happy I got to see him. Yes, he's very good. By the way, in the Zoom meeting that we're in, I sent you the link where I've only seen Jersey Girl once, but it was the last time I saw Bruce, not counting Broadway, and it's the end. He ends the show with Jersey Girl because they're in New Jersey. He's playing at the Met Stadium,
Okay.
and this is the one where the guy asked he had a wedding proposal in the middle of it.
Okay.
And I sent you the link. You can watch this on, YouTube.
Okay.
And it's perfect. I mean,
So,
you can imagine, the song Jersey Girl, and in the middle of it, Bruce goes, what's happening here?
yeah.
And he brings him up on stage, and
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, it's a great, you know, there's this marriage, and he's singing it, and then they do fireworks, and you go, oh my gosh, this was perfect.
Yeah. Let's hope that marriage lasts.
Yes, absolutely. um Gosh, this has been great, Jack. You've had
Thank
so
you.
many great stories and things to do. What have I not asked you that I should have?
Uh, Gee whiz, I think, well, I don't know. I mean, if you ask me one more question, we'd probably fill up another hour. So, which
Well,
I'm more than willing to come back and do this again sometime.
oh, I would love to have that. It is really good. I just didn't want to miss where you're like, oh, I forgot to tell you where Jimmy and I shared a beer.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
again, I don't have any beers with Jimmy Buffett story. I have stories with one of the little bars. We owned a bar in Fredericksburg here
Right.
at one time, not the one that I just sold, but another one that my older brother and
Mhm.
my dad owned. And we had Fingers Taylor play there many years ago. So I've shared a beer with Fingers Taylor. I've shared beers with Josh Leo, who used to play guitar with Jimmy Buffett back in the 80s. But all those stories are for another time. They'll take way too long to get into. But yeah, I got anytime.
All right, good. We'll make sure you do that. All right. Um, Time for the Mary question. And
Okay.
for those who are friends of Jack's, you may not know the story. My regular listeners do. Jay Armstrong is a retired honors English teacher in the Philadelphia area. But when he was teaching every year, he would take his seniors and his honors English senior class, and they would take 2 days breaking apart Road as a poem. They look at the lyrics, they talk about the imagery Bruce uses, the themes of the song, what other poems are similar, something like, The Road Lost Traveled. And at the end of the 2 days, the question he asked his class, and they would, have to write this out, is, does Mary get in the car? So, Jack, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
She does, but she does not go the entire ride. She gets out early.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
I think she buys into the dream. And then when they get below half a tank of gas, she just thinks, uh-oh, this isn't what I want. I don't know what I want, but it's not this.
Interesting.
And she gets out and hitchhikes back.
I like it. I like it a lot. That's a good answer.
Thank you.
Very nice. You know, I've had a lot of different answers, and one of the things that I love talking about is I did not connect Thunder Road and Racing in the Street, but someone said, in the Racing in the Street, there's a line, she sits on her daddy's porch.
Yep.
And he says, I think that's the same porch that she danced across.
Wow.
And I said, if it isn't, it should be.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. My wife and I have always thought, we always hear that question, what is the greatest opening line of any album? And we both agree it's Screen Door Slams. Because it's you just don't know what's going to happen from there. It's just everything's wide open after that.
So I just had a guy on the podcast. I haven't released it yet. We recorded on Sunday night, and he's a huge Guns N' Roses fan.
Okay.
Does a Guns N' Roses podcast, and so we spent over an hour talking about Guns N' Roses, and he shared that story. And so normally I had with you I'd forgotten, but normally when I send an agenda out, I put Mary question. I go, get the song Thunder Road, listen, read the lyrics, listen to the song. I'm going to ask you, does Mary get in the car?
Right.
So this guy said, I had never heard this song before.
Oh.
He said, and oh my goodness, I want to go explore more music from Bruce Springsteen.
Sure.
He said, I've heard, Born in the USA, and I've heard Dancing in the Dark. And he says, I've heard the hits, but I've never heard this song. And now when I hear that song, I go, oh my goodness, what am I missing?
Yeah.
So, and it's like we talked about a few minutes ago, when you list songs that mean a lot to you, it's hard if you're a Springsteen fan not to pick Thunder Road.
Sure.
It's just one of those songs.
Yeah.
All right. This has been a blast. I am so glad you took time to visit with me. I hope you had fun.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
No, Jack, I looked up your Twitter handle is @Hyland27.
Yep.
So I know that you'd love to hear from people.
Sure.
Let Jack know that you want him to come back and that you enjoyed the stories. I hope you and your family remain safe.
Thank you. You too.
We'll have to figure out the time zone when you're in Africa, and you'll have to share me stories of adventure when I have you back on again.
Depending on so we just moved the clocks back an hour last week. So Angola is currently 5 hours ahead of us. Typically they're either 5 or 6 hours ahead. So
okay, so that's not bad. Australia is my toughest.
Yeah,
that is
I would
the
imagine.
toughest when I have someone from Australia need to visit. We really do. Like England works fine,
Yep.
right? Like I do an early, like we're talking Saturday morning. That's usually their afternoon, so that works out really well. But Australia is my toughest one that I've had to work with people time zones.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Yeah. All right, listeners, please stay safe. Remember to social distance. Remember to wash your hands. Remember to wear a mask. And let's all be good to each other during these difficult times, because that's the only way we're going to get through it. For now, thank you. Be safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter @setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is @JesseJacksonDFW. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts, as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts, as well as a Mary Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now who does, you can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference. You just heard the fun-talking, hard-rocking, music-loving, album-ranking, fan-thinking, joy-spreading, lyric-reading, story-sharing podcast that is the one
the only Set Listing Bruce. Set Listing Bruce is part of the Southgate Media podcast group. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.